My name is Kate. About a year ago, my wife, Kim, and I decided to take a road trip across the United States. She had inherited $20,000 from her grandfather's passing. We had just finished college and talked about using the money to buy a house. But neither one of us had ever lived anywhere outside of Seattle, so we decided to take a road trip. See the country, gain some life experience, and maybe figure out what we wanted to do with our lives together. My grandmother agreed to look after our dog Max while we were on the road. On the day we left, we were dropping him off at her house, and she seemed weird. My grandmother immigrated here from Ireland with her parents when she was a child. She was raised to be superstitious, and I had always thought she was a little strange, but on this day she was a little over the top. My grandmother hugged us both and told us to be careful. There are things out there, things you have never seen in the city, things that live in shadows, and I cut her off. Grandma, I love you, but we're going to be late. We don't have time for fairy tales. My grandmother looked as if she was going to say something but stopped herself. She just nodded and hugged us both again. I left feeling like she had been trying to tell me something important. I know now what my grandmother was trying to tell us. People have been immigrating to the United States for centuries, and with them they bring their culture, their beliefs, their folk tales, and sometimes they bring other things. By the time we hit the road, it was about 9 a.m., a couple of hours later than we had planned, but that was fine. We didn't have a plan as much as far as where to and when to stop, but we had asked all of our friends for their advice, and we had quite a long list. We stopped at Leavenworth first. It was a quaint little German-style village nestled in the mountains. We had pretzels and bratwurst for lunch and spent some time browsing the shops. In one of the shops, Kim and I spent a good half an hour trying on novelty hats and taking selfies together. The clerk asked us if we were going to buy something or just spend all day trying on his merchandise. He was a little rude and I began to say something, but Kim showed me her phone. It was 4 p.m. We really should hit the road or we'll be stuck here. I removed the big top hat and handed it to the clerk, and we left. What's next on the list? I asked Kim as we headed back on the freeway. She finished posting the photos of us on Facebook and then pulled up the list on her phone. Greg said we need to hit Winthrop, she told me. She pulled up the directions on her phone. It's a little less than 3 hours north. Okay, I said. Pulling into Winthrop was like stepping out of a time machine. The main road was lined with old wooden buildings with wood plank sidewalks. It looked exactly like the set of an old western. We parked just off the main road and walked back to look at the shops. The wood sidewalk creaked under our feet as we walked from shop to shop. We spent hours browsing, looking at Western clothes and art in the stores, as well as several souvenir stores. Finally, we decided to get dinner. It was about 8 p.m. now, and the sun was starting to set. Given the Western theme of the town, barbecue was an easy choice. We ordered a sampler that had a little bit of almost everything on the menu. Let's sit outside, I proposed. It was a nice, warm summer evening, and I wanted to sit outside and people watch. We took our food and sat near the street. 4 men rode in on horses. They were wearing cowboy hats and chaps. If there hadn't been dozens of tourists wearing modern clothes, I would have sworn we were back on the frontier 200 years ago. The men stopped at the general store next to the restaurant. As they tied up their horses, I looked over to see Kim taking pictures of them on her phone. One of the men noticed this and tipped his hat at her. Howdy, he said. He patted his horse on the back and began to walk towards us. That sure is a big dog, Kim said with a smirk. He smiled and leaned against the log fence that surrounded the patio of the restaurant. You like horses? The cowboy asked Kim. If you're not already, you two should come by the rodeo tonight. It's right up the road. The cowboy pointed down the street. Kim and I both followed his gaze to the end of the street where we saw an arena. Jim, we heard a man yell, and turned back to see another cowboy at the front door of the general store. Jim, you coming or what? The man asked. Jim gave us another smile and tipped his hat again. Then he walked back to his friends. We should go to the rodeo, Kim said, beaming with excitement. Yeah, you're right. I knew that neither one of us had ever seen a rodeo and probably never would again. It was a good opportunity for a rare experience, and that is exactly what this trip was about. The sun was setting over the trees at the end of Main Street, casting a series of shadows that sprawled down the street towards us like fingers. By the time Kim and I reached the hotel, it was dark. The hotel, like the rest of the town, had a rustic, Wild West facade. There were 4 lamps at the front that were made to look like oil lamps. The door creaked loudly as I opened it. The place even sounded old. We were checked in and informed that we were in luck. There was one room available because somebody didn't show up. We went up to the room and Kim said she needed to shower before we went out and asked if I would walk back to the car and get her bags. I obliged and began to head out. The walk back was like walking through a completely different city. I could see about a couple hundred yards sheer from me. There were a few lights on the main street. And through the woods I could see some lights, and hear some commotion at the rodeo. But where I was walking, there was nothing. Even the moonlight had been blocked by the treetops overhead. I had a very unsettling feeling for some reason. I had always had this sixth sense, like a lizard brain feeling that something wasn't quite right. My parents thought I was paranoid or just had an overactive imagination, but my grandmother had always told me it was a gift. She said I was just like her. Whatever it was that I was feeling very uneasy, like there was darkness near me. I looked around but didn't see anyone. I suddenly felt very cold. It had been too warm all day to even consider wearing a jacket. I'd even thought about leaving my hoodie in the car. I was glad I hadn't. I zipped up my hoodie, though it did little to fight off the cold. I could even see my breath in the small amount of moonlight that fought through the trees. As I walked, I began to hear footsteps behind me. I turned and didn't see anybody behind me. I began to walk faster. The footsteps began to quicken behind me. I heard leaves crunch under the steps. I turned again and I saw movement. Not behind me, but off to the side. I could barely make out the shape of a large creature running through the woods. It was less than 100 feet behind me and gaining quickly. I began to run. The steps grew louder. They grew closer. My heart beat against my ribs and my lungs began to burn with each inhale of cold air. I could hear the creature come out of the woods and hit the street. And then sounds began to sound very familiar. I turned to see what was chasing me. It was a huge black horse. The rider crouched low on the horse and kicked its spurs into its sides mercilessly. I turned forward again. I put every ounce of strength I had into escape, and my legs began to ache with the effort. I could hear the footsteps right behind me. I knew that any second now the rider would run me down. I waited for the impact, but to my surprise, the horseman rode past me. I watched in horror as he stopped 30 feet ahead of me and sat up, then pulled back on the reins. The horse reared back and its front legs kicked angrily at the sky. The horse let out a sinister neigh, and the horseman lifted a bearded axe into the air. But that isn't what made my blood run cold. It was what the horseman held in his other hand that chilled me to the bone. He lowered the axe and raised his other hand to reveal a head. He held it by the scalp, and even in the dim light, I could see it wore an unnatural, inhuman smile that spread from ear to ear, revealing chipped yellow and black teeth. And where the eyes should be, there were dark, empty orbs. Not empty exactly. There was something evil in those dark, soulless sockets. I couldn't see as much as I could feel that it was looking at me. And then it said something. Something that meant nothing to me at the moment. Jim Fredrickson. I stood there panting for a moment. I considered running, but I wouldn't make it to the hotel if the horseman chased me. I was closer to my car than the hotel, but I would have to make it past the horse. He was standing right in the middle of the intersection between the general store and the restaurant we had eaten at earlier. And then the horseman seemed to relax his posture. He lowered his head and slowly turned his horse into the woods and began walking away. This may not sound any crazier than what I have already seen, but they just seemed to fade away. They didn't disappear into the woods, but seemed to vanish into thin air before they even got into the woods. I waited for a second to make sure I was in the clear and to process what I had just seen. Then I rushed to my car. I ran all the way. As soon as I was inside, I locked the doors. I sat there for several minutes, catching my breath. I began to warm up as soon as the horseman vanished, but I was still trembling. I turned the heater on. Once I calmed down, I began starting to drive back to the hotel and was rehearsing what I would tell Kim when I saw her. I knew she'd think I would think I was crazy, and honestly, I had just about convinced myself that I had imagined the whole thing. Until I turned onto the main street and saw the telltale blue and red lights of a police car. It was parked on the shoulder of the road, right next to the spot where the horseman had stopped. Maybe somebody else saw what I saw, I thought to myself. I slowed down and stopped so I could ask what was happening. The police officer was placing bright orange cones on the street. Behind him, I could see a body on the street. I got out and asked him what was happening. He informed me that there had been an accident. I saw a man on the phone next to the body. He seemed to be crying and having a very difficult phone call. I recognized the man on the phone as it was the cowboy from earlier. Not the one we'd been talking to, but his friend. The officer had walked away to put up more cones, so I took the opportunity to get closer and see who it was. The man was lying face down. His neck was bent at an odd angle that left his head laying on his shoulder, and his cowboy hat was a few feet away. The other man was off the phone now and seemed to be collecting himself. "What happened?" I asked him. He sniffled and took a deep breath to steady his voice. "Jim and I were riding over to the rodeo. Something spooked the horses. Damn thing bucked us both off. I got lucky and landed on my back. By the time I got up and dusted myself off, the horses were gone, and Jim landed on his head, broke his neck." I felt the chill again. Jim? What was his last name? The man gave me an odd look, as if he wondered why I cared. I saw him look over my shoulder, and I glanced back to see the officer coming our way. "Fredrickson," he said. I wanted a chance to tell him what I saw. It's better that I didn't get a chance to. The officer interrupted me. "Did you get a hold of your wife?" he asked the cowboy. "Yeah, she has the trailer parked around the corner, and she's getting word to Jim's parents," the cowboy answered. "Ma'am, you shouldn't be here. We have paramedics on the way and animal control to help round up the horses. I'd appreciate if you get the car off the road. We're going to need space to get an ambulance in here, as well as keep traffic moving." The officer mansplained me. I gave the cowboy one last look and offered my condolences. Then I was on my way back to the hotel. Kim could tell there was something wrong as soon as I walked in. She always seemed to know what I was feeling. "What's wrong, baby?" she asked. She hugged me and sat me down on the bed. "What happened?" I exhaled deeply. "I thought they were just fairy tales," I told her. "What?" she asked. She had a puzzled look on her face and rubbed my shoulder sympathetically. "What was just fairy tales?" "When I was a little girl, my grandmother told me fairy tales from the old country. Stories she grew up with in Ireland. One of them was about the Dullahan, and I saw him tonight." I cried out. "What are you talking about? What is a Dullahan?" Kim asked me. She looked much more concerned now. "The story goes that centuries ago, a soldier rode into battle. He lost his head in battle and came back as the Dullahan. He doesn't exactly kill people as much as he comes to tell them when it is their time." I proceeded to tell her exactly what I had seen tonight. The horseman, the fact that he had called Jim's name, and then Jim died in this same spot. I waited for a response from her. She stared at me for a minute, and as the seconds of silence ticked by, I began to wonder if she thought I was just making it up or if I was crazy. Then she picked up my hand and held it. "Tell me more about these fairy tales," she said.